Greetings, my name is Brian Guthrie, aka Guthron. As some of you know, I've been looking into combat trauma, specifically in the Civil War. That can be challenging when historical records are scarce or just do not exist. For a conflict like the American War for Independence, this is especially true. So what do? Well, we have to look at sources from a different angle. Kind of like how historians look for other voices taking parts in events. To show you how this might work, let's look at prisoner of war records. Why those? What they did with the prisoners can give us a peek into what being a prisoner might have done to them. In the Revolutionary War, the prisoner problem proved especially complicated. You see, King George declared the Americans traitors to the crown, and we all know what happens to traitors, right? There's a surefire way to garner support for your cause. Luckily, British commanders on site recognized how trying and killing all of their prisoners might make their jobs harder. So, instead of killing them all, they starved them instead. On boats, of course, because the Brits love their boats. How did George Washington, commander of the Continental Army, respond? He said to take care of them. Feed them, clothe them, tend to their wounds. Washington didn't want his prisoners to have any reason to complain of how American prisons were as bad as British ones, which were in boats. Bad ones. At that point, anything was an upgrade. Anyway, the Redcoats couldn't be bothered to try, and Washington's response was to follow the rules. Wait, rules? What rules? Rules of war. They had those? Ah, yes, they did indeed. You see, war making was a gentleman's thing. As long as everyone played by the rules, wars were humane. As humane as lining up a bunch of men and shooting balls of metal of varying sizes at them could be. Still, there were rules, but not everyone played by the same rules, as we see with the Redcoats and their floating prisons of death. So, did Washington's plan work? Well, sort of. You see, one of those rules allowed the parties to exchange their prisoners. Wait, what? But what was to stop them from just going to another part of America and fighting there? An excellent point, and one they were all well aware of. But what to do instead? If you kept the prisoners, you had to pay to keep them fed and clothed and sheltered. For a fledgling nation like the United States, where everyone was gung-ho to fight, but very allergic to paying for anything, taking care of their own army was a challenge. Why pay for both sides? So back to Washington. He had to figure out some way to deal with the problem. He suddenly found himself with a lot of German prisoners after his icy trip across the New Jersey River in the middle of the night. From other battles also. Seriously, they ended up capturing 2 entire armies, and they all expected to go home within a year. So what did Washington do? He tried to set up an exchange system. How do we know this? Well, we can use America's Historical Imprints database to look for records. Here we found this record, entitled A Report of Commissioners for Settling a Cartel for the Exchange of Prisoners, penned in 1779. This is Washington's report to Congress on how they were trying to set up a cartel to exchange prisoners, and not just the officers. That was easy to do and they were already doing it. It was that system of exchange that they were trying to imitate with this cartel idea. So, did it work? Well, let's return to the database. There we found this record. It's a report regarding the exchange of prisoners between the Americans and the British in South Carolina 2 years later. Oh, and look at this detail, wherever they may at present be. Here at last is a hint about what prison life was like on the American side, where they kept prisoners depended entirely on what facilities they had available. Some were locked up in garrisons, others had to camp out in the fields, others were working in the fields. Later in the war, the Hessians had been marched all over to keep them away from British forces, and as a result, it started working all over the place. It isn't much, but it's a hint, a clue. British camps, on the face of it, sound much worse. Another hint of where to look. So now what? Well, you take those nuggets, those tiny tidbits of information, and you explore them. After all, how else do you think we know what conditions on the ships of death were like, or that they even existed? How do you think we know what happened to those Hessian soldiers? A lot of them did escape, marry American women, and settle down, never to leave. Oh, I wonder if any of those women kept journals or diaries. And already we have another clue. Time to get searching. You never know. You might discover you have Hessian ancestry.